What will happen to Donald Trump if Ghislaine Maxwell seeks a pardon deal? What if the Epstein saga is far from over and Donald Trump is suddenly dragged back into the center of it? Imagine this. Ghislaine Maxwell, convicted and serving time for her role in Jeffrey Epstein's notorious crimes, decides to pursue a pardon deal. The political earthquake this could trigger is almost impossible to overstate. For Trump, who has long faced questions about his proximity to Epstein and Maxwell, the optics alone would be devastating. Even a whisper of negotiation could reignite scrutiny, raise fresh legal and ethical questions, and dominate the news cycle in ways no campaign strategist could control. Would Trump's past associations come back to haunt him, or would he find a way to spin the narrative in his favor? Stay tuned as we break it down right now. The idea that Ghislaine Maxwell, long associated with Jeffrey Epstein, could pursue a pardon deal raises an extraordinarily sensitive and consequential question for American politics and for Donald Trump in particular. While speculative, it is a scenario grounded in recent history, patterns of presidential clemency, and the interplay between politics, justice, and public perception. Maxwell, convicted for her role in facilitating the sexual exploitation and trafficking of minors, is one of the most notorious figures of the past decade. Any discussion of her possible pardon, therefore, intersects with profound moral, legal, and political issues. Donald Trump, who as president frequently used his pardon power in controversial ways and who has long-standing links to both Epstein and Maxwell, would face immediate scrutiny if such a move were seriously considered. This script analyzes the issue in depth, examining legal frameworks, institutional practices, the role of Congress, public perception, historical parallels, and electoral consequences. The goal is to understand comprehensively what could happen to Trump if Maxwell were to seek a pardon deal, not through sensationalism, but through a grounded exploration of facts, context, and precedent. The Constitution grants the president broad authority to issue pardons and commutations for federal crimes. This authority is nearly absolute, checked only by the political process and by impeachment. Historically, the Department of Justice manages pardon petitions through the Office of the Pardon Attorney, which collects records, evaluates applications, and makes recommendations. However, presidents retain the discretion to bypass this process. The legal effect of a pardon is sweeping. It forgives the underlying offense and prevents further federal prosecution. In Maxwell's case, a pardon could either fully absolve her of her crimes or reduce her sentence significantly. Importantly, pardons do not erase state-level crimes, and since some Epstein-related cases intersect with state jurisdictions, the relief might be limited in scope. A conditional pardon is also possible, structured to require cooperation or silence. If Maxwell were to pursue such a request, her motivations would be obvious. She would gain freedom or reduced punishment, and she might seek to use what she knows about powerful individuals as leverage. Legally, a pardon would be valid if signed by the president, but the political cost of such a decision would be extraordinary. For Trump, the legal mechanics matter less than the symbolic implications, but understanding these foundations clarifies why the scenario is both plausible and dangerous. Trump's history with Epstein and Maxwell is well established. Photographs, social appearances, and past statements confirm that he knew both personally. In a 2002 interview, Trump described Epstein as a terrific guy and mentioned Epstein's interest in younger women. Later, Trump claimed to have distanced himself after a falling out. Maxwell was also seen at Trump properties, including Mar-a-Lago. During his presidency, Trump publicly wished Maxwell well when she was arrested, a comment that drew criticism. The transcript provided highlights how Trump has dismissed Epstein and Maxwell controversies as a hoax, while his allies in Congress, such as Speaker Mike Johnson, downplayed the significance of related disclosures. Trump's personal lawyer, Todd Blanche, reportedly engaged with Maxwell under questionable circumstances, further linking Trump to her legal proceedings. These connections mean that if Maxwell were to pursue a pardon, the media and public would immediately connect Trump to the request, regardless of his formal role. The optics would be damning, creating the impression of complicity, favoritism, or at minimum, poor judgment. Even if Trump had no direct involvement, the historical record ensures that the spotlight would fall on him. raising the stakes dramatically. The testimony of survivors of Epstein's crimes underscores one of the most important dimensions of this issue. Victims have statutory rights to be informed, consulted, and treated with fairness during legal proceedings. According to the transcript, survivors reported having little or no communication from the Department of Justice about Maxwell's case, including major developments such as interviews, transfers, or memos. This silence compounds their trauma and erodes trust in institutions. If Maxwell were to seek a pardon, survivors would almost certainly organize publicly against it. Their testimony would carry moral weight that no politician could easily dismiss. Congressional committees, particularly the judiciary committees, would hold hearings, invite survivors, and demand accountability from DOJ officials. For Trump, this would be a nightmare scenario. His opponents would amplify survivor voices, juxtaposing them with his past comments and associations. The clash between victim advocacy and presidential power would be politically explosive. Even if the pardon were legally sound, it would be perceived as an injustice that sacrificed victim rights for elite protection. Former Senator Doug Jones, quoted in the transcript, criticized the Department of Justice's handling of Epstein-related matters. He described how victim protections were ignored, how political interests seemed to dictate outcomes, and how the DOJ's credibility has eroded. A pardon deal for Maxwell would deepen concerns that the justice system is rigged to favor the powerful. If Trump were seen as influencing or benefiting from such a decision, it would confirm narratives of a justice system captured by presidential prerogatives rather than impartial rule of law. For career prosecutors and agents, the message would be demoralizing. For the public, it would be another reason to distrust institutions. Institutional credibility is fragile, and once broken, it takes decades to restore. Trump has often capitalized on public cynicism toward government, but in this case, he could become the symbol of the corruption he once claimed to oppose. The DOJ's reputation would be collateral damage, and Trump's personal brand would be at the center of the controversy. History shows that controversial pardons can permanently alter political legacies. Gerald Ford's pardon of Richard Nixon was justified as an act of healing, but is widely considered a factor in Ford's electoral defeat. Bill Clinton's pardon of financier Mark Rich, who had fled the country to avoid prosecution, generated bipartisan outrage and continues to be cited as an example of corrupt clemency. Donald Trump himself used pardons expansively, granting clemency to allies such as Michael Flynn, Roger Stone, and Paul Manafort. Critics argued that he weaponized the pardon power to protect loyalists. Against this backdrop, a pardon for Maxwell would stand out as one of the most controversial in American history. Associating a president with the release of a convicted sex trafficker would be politically toxic. The historical lesson is clear. Presidents who misuse the pardon power face long-term reputational consequences, and Trump would be no exception. Beyond optics, there are tangible legal risks. Survivor testimony could introduce new evidence, prompting prosecutors to reopen inquiries into Epstein's network. Even absent direct accusations, questions about whether Trump or his administration shielded Maxwell could fuel investigations. Civil litigation is another possibility. Survivors could sue, arguing that Trump's administration failed to uphold victim rights, perpetuating harm. Such lawsuits might not succeed legally, but they would keep the issue in the public eye and drain resources. Moreover, congressional inquiries could expose internal communications, revealing whether Trump or his aides interfered in Maxwell's case. Even without criminal liability, the reputational damage would be severe. For Trump, legal risk is inseparable from political risk. The mere suggestion of impropriety would dominate headlines and campaign narratives. The Republican Party has been shaped by loyalty to Trump, but a Maxwell pardon would test that loyalty. Some Republicans would defend him, framing the controversy as partisan hysteria. Others, particularly moderates or vulnerable incumbents, might distance themselves. The split could deepen internal divisions. For party leaders such as Speaker Johnson, who defended Trump's transparency, the issue would be difficult to navigate. Supporting Trump could alienate key constituencies, while opposing him could trigger backlash from his base. Either way, the controversy would weaken the party's coherence. For Trump, this means a less unified coalition at a time when unity is essential for electoral success. The pardon debate could become a wedge issue within Republican politics, with long-lasting consequences. Elections are not won only on policy, but on trust, character, and perception. A pardon for Maxwell, or even the pursuit of one, would provide opponents with devastating campaign material. Images of Trump with Epstein and Maxwell could be paired with survivor testimony in advertisements. Narratives about Trump protecting elites at the expense of victims would resonate with swing voters. Suburban women, independents, and younger voters could be particularly alienated. Even if Trump argued that the pardon was based on legal principles, the moral outrage would overshadow technical justifications. In a closely contested election, this issue alone could shift enough votes to determine the outcome. For Trump, the risk is not just reputational, but existential in terms of his political career. Media framing would be decisive. Outlets critical of Trump would focus relentlessly on survivor outrage and Trump's past associations. Conservative outlets might attempt to downplay the issue or reframe it as an attack on Trump. Social media would amplify survivor voices and spread images instantly, making narrative control nearly impossible. In modern politics, perception often outweighs fact. Even if no new evidence of Trump's wrongdoing emerged, the symbolism of a pardon for Maxwell would dominate public discourse. Once entrenched, perceptions are difficult to reverse. For Trump, whose image is central to his appeal, the damage could be irreversible. The Epstein-Maxwell scandal was not confined to the United States. Figures from Europe, the Middle East, and beyond were implicated or rumored to be involved. If Maxwell received a pardon, the international reaction would be fierce. Allies would question America's commitment to justice and human rights. Adversaries such as Russia and China would use the scandal as propaganda, portraying the United States as hypocritical. For Trump, whose foreign policy legacy already includes controversies with autocrats, the scandal would reinforce narratives of corruption and elite impunity. America's moral authority on the global stage would suffer, and Trump would be the face of that decline. At its core, the Maxwell scenario highlights a broader crisis of trust in American institutions. Public faith in the DOJ, FBI, and Congress is already fragile. If survivors continue to be ignored and if powerful offenders receive leniency, cynicism will deepen. Trump has often benefited from attacking institutions as corrupt, but in this case, he could be seen as exploiting the very corruption he denounces. The contradiction would be stark. The clash between outsider populism and insider privilege could collapse his narrative. For democracy, the cost would be immense. Institutional trust, once lost, cannot be easily restored. Maxwell's pardon would symbolize not reform, but decay. One of the most striking developments in recent years is the emergence of survivors as powerful advocates. In the transcript, survivors described their exclusion from DOJ processes, and their frustration was palpable. Yet their voices are increasingly heard in Congress, in media, and in civil society. If Maxwell pursued a pardon, survivors would mount a public campaign against it. Their stories resonate across partisan lines. Politicians ignore them at their peril. For Trump, facing organized victim advocacy would be politically devastating. The contrast between survivor voices and elite privilege would sharpen public outrage. Beyond Trump, the rise of victim advocacy could reshape debates over clemency, transparency, and accountability for years to come. Several outcomes are possible. First, the DOJ and White House could reject Maxwell's request outright, minimizing Trump's involvement but keeping the controversy alive. Second, the request could be quietly shelved, creating ambiguity and fueling speculation. Third, the request could be approved, either conditionally or fully, sparking a firestorm of outrage. Each scenario carries risks for Trump. Even without approval, the process itself would expose his past associations and rekindle public debate. Approval, however, would be catastrophic, generating legal challenges, congressional hearings, and relentless media scrutiny. For Trump, there is no outcome that leaves him unscathed. The only question is the scale of the damage. The possibility of Ghislaine Maxwell seeking a pardon deal forces a confrontation with fundamental questions about justice, politics, and accountability. For Donald Trump, the stakes could not be higher. Legally, he faces potential investigations and civil suits. Politically, he risks alienating swing voters, fracturing his party, and damaging his electoral chances. Institutionally, he would be seen as emblematic of a justice system that protects elites while neglecting victims. Historically, he would be remembered not only for his presidency, but for his association with one of the darkest scandals in modern memory. Internationally, America's credibility would be undermined. Ultimately, the issue is larger than Trump. It is about whether the American justice system serves the public or the powerful. If Maxwell were to pursue a pardon, the country would be forced to choose between accountability and impunity. For Trump, the consequences would likely be severe, reshaping his legacy and possibly his political future.